On this episode of Newt's World, on Friday, June 13th, Israel launched a surprise attack on dozens of targets inside Iran, including nuclear sites, and killed many of the Iranian military's top leaders. Israeli strikes have killed at least 224 people in Iran and injured hundreds more. On Monday, Iran struck back with a barrage of ballistic missiles, hitting several Israeli cities and killing at least 24 people. But the question remains, will the United States join the conflict? Here to discuss the Israeli-Iranian conflict, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Iran program, which, by the way, is something I pay constant attention to. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies is a remarkable institution. Behnam, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, sir. Thank you.
This is an amazing time that we're chatting. Can you help us understand the scale and significance of Israel's campaign and why it is different from past campaigns?
Well, first and foremost, this is the longest ever. We're in day 5 right now of the overt Israel-Iran shooting war, but this is the longest ever campaign on Iranian territory since the 1979 revolution that follows the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war. That was actually the longest conventional war of the 20th century. It's something that is often forgotten in history books. Since the 1979 revolution, Iran has carried out a shadow war, a proxy war against Israel that really came to a head in the post-October 7 Middle East when it crept out of the shadows twice, once in April and once in October, with direct ballistic missile attacks from Iranian territory to Israeli territory, something we never saw even during the Cold War, meaning a non-nuclear weapon state fire nuclear-capable ballistic missiles at a nuclear weapon state and then live to tell the tale. These attacks by Israel on June 12, June 13 were coordinated, they were synchronized, they took out the military brain trust of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The regime, even in day 5, if you ask me, is still phased, is still struggling to respond. And Israel, if we're looking at the military performance of this, and I'm happy to get to the politics and the nuclear side as well, if we're looking at the military performance to this, they have taken the regime's greatest quantitative asset, its ballistic missile arsenal, which is the largest in the entire Middle East, and quickly attriting it and cutting it such that the regime is facing a use-or-lose problem, as well as, of course, what to fire, because the Israelis have actually created a drone base on Iranian territory that is targeting Iranian ballistic missiles as soon as they pop up on their launchers before they can be fired. So it's turned the regime's quantitative advantage on its head. And the longer this conflict goes on, the million-dollar question will increasingly become, what role will Uncle Sam play? What role will the U.S. play in all of this? And what role can the Iranian people play in all of this?
The Israeli campaign clearly had been planned for months, and they'd thought it all through, and they have remarkable penetration of Iran. I've been watching a TV series you may have seen called Tehran, which is basically the Mossad operating literally inside Iranian territory with help from Iranians who are either opposed to the regime or for some other reason are willing to work with the Israelis. And apparently, if I understand it, one of the pieces of this campaign was they actually built the equivalent of a drone factory inside Tehran and launched drones from inside Tehran against various Iranian assets in a way which is almost like science fiction.
Like science fiction, but also part of the reality of, I would really say, the 2-decade chasm that we've seen between the state in Iran and the street in Iran. Because let me tell you, sir, and I know you've mentioned this before, the people in Iran are no fans of the government in Iran, but also the people in Iran are quite patriotic, quite nationalist. I myself am a first-generation American of Iranian ancestry. I'm born and raised here in the States. Sometimes it's quite obvious Iranians are among the most nationalistic of any peoples in the region. So one could say, how would this happen in an exceptionally nationalist population where the conventional wisdom is that if there was an attack, there would always be a rally? And it is because of the chasm between the state and the street. It is because of the fact that the regime is Islamist and the people is nationalist. It's because the regime is old and the people are young. And these two things are like water and oil. And the Iranian people have been saying this loud and proud in their multiple iterations of anti-regime protests, even dating back to 2009, when they said, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran. And you've seen Iranian policy go exactly 180 degrees in the opposite direction, sacrificing the Iranian national interest and the public good and the health and welfare of the average Iranian on the altar of exporting the 1979 revolution to the Eastern Mediterranean. I have to tell you, there was a story in Axios this weekend that reminded me of something a actual former Iranian intelligence minister had said. It was an intelligence minister from the mid-2010s who was saying this in 2021. And he was saying that the level of Mossad penetration in Iran is astronomical. And he was saying this in 2021. So imagine what it must be in 2025. And he essentially intonated that at that time, no regime official should sleep safely at night because of this level of penetration. And he actually blamed it. He himself a cleric, he himself an ideologue, he himself an intel minister. He blamed it on the regime's ideology and its warring factions and its creating of a state within a state. And just looking from the outside, the regime has been policing cyberspace, the regime has been policing hijabs, but the gross incompetence of the regime, coupled with the population's willingness to contest this regime at any cost, is exactly how, in my view, you get the Israelis to be able to build a drone base right under the nose of the Ayatollahs.
I'm curious about this because there's an argument apparently underway that the establishment, including the intelligence community, had given the Iranians a pretty high level of capability, but there were analysts who deeply disagreed and said, look, this kind of a regime can't be very competent because it's not going to be able to reward merit, and it's not going to be able to promote people purely based on merit because it'll be so busy, first of all, being corrupted financially, and second, worried about absolute loyalty to the Ayatollah. And it does seem that in many ways, starting with the remarkable Israeli campaign in the spring, where they gained total air dominance to an embarrassing degree for the Russians, proved that American technology was simply generations ahead of the Russian air defense systems. But if you come all the way through this, it does seem like there's a certain lacking level of just plain everyday competence in the Iranian system right now.
Certainly. And if you're starting at a baseline negative number, once that negative number meets an exogenous shock, like 4:30 in the morning, your entire military commanding heights, your entire strategic brain trust being killed in a missile attack, then you're going to be performing even worse. So it's going to take quite a bit of time to get out of the hole. And that's what I mean when I say I think even in day 5 of this conflict, the regime itself is quite shattered. And you mentioned this ideological versus technical versus competency paradigm and problem. And these things are found, these warring with one another in various elements of the Iranian system, in the political establishment, in the military establishment, in the security services, even within the clergy. You see this tug of war between politics and competence. And this is a regime that actually rewards loyalty rather than that competence. There is a phrase in Persian, I'll say it came from the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s when the Khomeinists were purifying the universities and everything else. The phrase was taqwa na tavana, meaning righteousness, not competence. They would reward righteousness, they would reward loyalty. And like any other authoritarian regime that is remotely afraid of anything military, they engage in coup-proofing, just as next-door neighbor former Saddam used to do. And this is a very toxic combination if you are unpopular and you're also trying to literally fight technologically superior adversaries like the Israelis or even the Americans. So this was all a witch's brew, in my view.
From that perspective, I've written several things arguing that the real goal has to be regime change, not just taking out the nuclear system. Because if they take out the nuclear system but the regime stays in charge, eventually they'll rebuild it. So if you're really serious about getting to a peaceful, long 30, 40, 50-year coexistence, you really have to find a way to break the entire system of the mullah dictatorship. What would your take on that be?
I think we have to have at this point in time the courage of our convictions to say the 2 words that are perhaps the 5th rail of politics in Washington, D.C., which is regime change. As we speak, there's a huge Republican, I don't want to say civil war, but a huge Republican internal struggle over the soul of the party, over what kind of Republican statecraft we're going to see in the 21st century. I think Donald Trump has done a good job balancing these 2 competing visions and value sets. of isolationism versus internationalism. They're both organic in the American policy and body politic. But as it relates to Iran, there aren't many places in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, where you can marry your head and your heart. And given that politically, voters in this country have been voting to do less in the Middle East and not more since the Bush II administration, every president has come in, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump again, trying to actually deliver on that promise and then getting sucked back in. I think the only real way you create the political space to do that and deal with great power competition is if you flip the script on the Ayatollahs. Because there's no straight line in the world where you appease the Ayatollahs and counter the CCP. You have to deal with the most urgent state threat there.
Trump has been shifting. He's always said pretty clearly there cannot be an Iranian nuclear weapon. They did a lot of dances and met and all that stuff for 60 days. But the bottom line was always, if we have a deal, it's going to mean no nuclear weapons. And now I notice in the last few days, he's moving toward basically saying to the Iranians, it'd be very smart of you to surrender before you're annihilated, which is a pretty bleak, direct statement. And my sense is that this growing awareness that the nuclear program was much bigger than we expected, the effort to build next generation ballistic missiles that would have been extraordinarily dangerous to Israel are much bigger. And I think for a lot of us, and I think for almost all Israelis, the pictures of Iranian missiles hitting Tehran and the simple thought, what if one of them had a nuclear warhead, pretty much has hardened the line of both Israel and the Trump administration. At least that's my sense, that we're now into a struggle that's probably not going to end with the Ayatollah still being in charge.
I think we could go, based on the very fast-moving facts on the ground, we could be going in that direction. I still think the president means what he says when he intonated ever since even before entering office, when he was campaigning in 2015, 2016, that he, quote, buys bad deals and makes them into good deals, and that he tried to fix the Iran deal first, and that he spent some time trying to negotiate it now again in term two. I do think in that world, the president may see Israeli military action and Israeli military prowess as actually a source of leverage to tell Khamenei, listen, I'm the only thing that is standing between you and certain death coming from the Israelis. So dismantle or die, dismantle or watch your program be dismantled for you, or potentially even watch your regime be dismantled for you. I mean, this has great implications for the future of U.S. foreign policy in the region, for sure, as well as for the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship based on how such a thing would be done. But I certainly see the president trying to maximize all of his options here, both on the diplomatic front to drive an exceptionally hard bargain to make the Ayatollah know that there is no way out but through, to basically get the second supreme leader of Iran to do what the first supreme leader of Iran did, which is to realize when he's losing, as Khomeini did in the end of the Iran-Iraq war, to drink the proverbial poison chalice. But also, I think the president actually has to have what the 9/11 Commission report warned about, which is imagination. And we have to see this as an imagination issue. We have to dare to imagine a fundamentally different Iran that doesn't perpetually sucker the U.S. in with a missile issue, a drone issue, a terrorism issue, a nuclear issue, that we get to drive the conversation. And that fundamentally we will always be reacting to something so long as this regime is there and in power.
I mean, it seems to me, while Trump has not talked about regime change, the standard he's setting for an agreement is almost impossible for this regime to achieve. It's pretty clear that Trump is going to insist that they dismantle all of it. It seems to me that for the regime, for the dictatorship, they may literally not be able to handle the stress of that agreement.
That certainly is one view and is one reason why many believe that Khamenei has rejected, obviously, the dismantlement lingo, and is also why he's held firm on something like uranium enrichment, which, by the way, Iran has not stopped doing for a single day since August 2006. I mean, that's the thing that really got us into this crisis, Believe it or not, there was a time when Europe and Russia and China and America were passing multiple UN Security Council resolutions, all united in the belief that there should be no enrichment in the Islamic Republic of Iran, particularly so long as they were violating their safeguards agreements. But here we are, nearly 2 decades later, and facing literally the exact same problem. I think that is one theory. And another is that I think you can get the Ayatollahs who fundamentally love life more than you and me. There's this picture, even among some of our friends, more Republican or more hawkish foreign policy circles, that see things through the prism of ideology. And absolutely, you have to understand the revolutionary and Islamist and authoritarian ideology of Iran's clerics. It's Islamism and Marxism and third worldism and all of those dangerous isms. But we shouldn't be ideological about ideology. And what I mean by that is if you speak to people who've come from Iran more recently, you will see that a cleric, a theocrat, is actually one of the most corrupt, opportunistic people. Ideology is an ends as well as a means to an end for those types of people. And I think in that kind of world, if they are really put to the choice, if Trump really grabs their jugular, maximum pressure could work, could deliver. You have to put the adversary in the position to have to make a mistake, to drive them to choose between, again, their economy or the bomb, or a dismantling or dying, to make it a lose-lose no matter what. And the art of the deal is constantly making your adversary settle for the least bad option with as little cost to you as possible. So I think there was potential there for that. But nonetheless, we are where we are now. And I think Trump's leverage has significantly increased. But lest we forget, ideology is still powerful. There is a world in which the regime does not want to take the knee to Donald Trump, even though technically they already have, because for 7 years they said no negotiations with Trump. And then spring 2025, okay, we'll negotiate with Trump so long as it's indirect.
And now, of course, they're saying, we'll be glad to negotiate with Trump if he'll just get the Israelis to stop. Suddenly he's becoming more desirable by comparison. One of the things I was struck with, and I know you must have seen the same thing, was the video of the Israelis hitting the Iranian state broadcasting system. You may know, since you speak Farsi, what she was saying at that moment, but had a little bit of a throwback to Baghdad Bob. We can hang tough. This is not that bad. And suddenly the studio gets bombed. Do you think that had any significance? And do you think that it sent any signal to the Iranian people about what was going on?
It absolutely had immense significance, both technical and political, because this is a TV station that is the state broadcasting arm of the government of the Islamic Republic that brings the regime's views, values, and interests onto the TV screens and multimedia of Iranian citizenry. This is a TV station that I think was sanctioned under the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken. So way back in the day, it coordinates with the Ministry of Intelligence and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It airs tortured and false confessions of everybody from Iranian reformists to regular citizens to even dual nationals it's paraded. It really is spewing the invective and is synonymous with that kind of corrupt, revolutionary resistance ideology. And you are right, if memory serves me correct, the presenter, I think, was going on a tirade about resistance in America, and then had to obviously flee the scene because of the strike. But there's also an equally chilling, powerful video from a little bit later on of that strike that was also making its way around on Persian social media. And it was from a distance seeing that building. It's the IRIB, Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting. It was that building in Tehran viewed from a distance, potentially from a camera or drone, who knows, with the call to prayer in the background and the entire edifice of this one building, nothing else, but just this one building burning and with black smoke rising. And that is the kind of stuff that in the medium term, not right now, because bombs are still falling and Iranian citizens, regardless of their political orientation, are all in survival mode, particularly the nearly 10 million that live in the capital, Tehran. But nonetheless, this is the stuff that can stiffen the spine of anti-regime Iranians. And, if I had 1 second to advertise to the Israelis, I'm not here in the strike world. I still think there was room for a lot more maximum pressure. But the Israelis need to be translating these targets, emotionally translating these targets for the Iranian audience. Why is it important that the Israelis have struck IRIB? Why is it important that the Israelis have struck the commander of the aerospace force? It's not just because this guy had his finger on the trigger of the missiles going to Israel. It's because that guy in January 2020 fired on a civilian airliner, killing over 170 innocent people. Israel is also dismantling the apparatus of repression. And that's why this strike on IRIB, the television, is very politically and technically significant in my view.
To make a point you referenced, in 2022, the U.S. Department of the Treasury, this is under Biden, released a press release saying they are designating the IRIB and its subsidiaries not as objective media outlets, but rather as a critical tool in the Iranian government's mass suppression and censorship campaign against its own people. They went on to say IRIB has produced and recently broadcast televised interviews of individuals being forced to confess that their relatives were not killed by Iranian authorities during nationwide protests, but died due to accidental, unrelated causes. And I assume that related back to about 2 years ago when they killed 500 people for being part of, in effect, demonstrations.
Exactly. It was the post-2022-23 Women Life Freedom movement that was triggered by the killing of an innocent girl in Tehran she was 22 years old. Her name was Mahsa Jina Amini, for not properly wearing her hijab. She was beaten by security forces and then sustained major mortal wounds that led to her death just a few days later in a hospital in Tehran, actually separated from her family. And protests began that fall 2022 and mushroomed into the biggest ever anti-regime protests we saw since the 1979 revolution.
This is a regime where a young lady who didn't totally cover her hair, if I remember correctly, she had it, but it wasn't totally covered, somehow infuriated the guards, and they beat her to death. And then that led to a huge public outrage, which they then suppressed, I think, with about 5,000 arrests and 500 killings.
And they followed that. There was a less advertised story, but we actually at FDD, we created a tracker of it because living and working in Washington, there's plenty of NGOs talk about women's rights and human rights. We noticed there was a whole string of attacks on young schoolgirls, almost something out of the playbook of the Taliban, but by the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they were basically chemical attacks, causing tons of basically young teenage and preteen girls who were going to school to get sick. And this, in our view, was a direct campaign, a state campaign against the next generation of Iran's best and brightest female youth. And this, I think, was some crazy deterrent, basically WMD used by the state against society to instill fear. So yes, they married that campaign of killing and arrests and detention with this CW campaign as well, which is really horrifying.
This is one of those rare regimes. They're not quite as bad as the Syrians who used to be, but they're very close. This is one of the worst regimes in the world in terms of how it oppresses its own people, while at the same time threatening all of its neighbors. Now, I've noticed this with Hamas and Hezbollah, and now with the Iranians, that the Israelis really focus on taking out the leadership and seem to have an amazing level of intelligence about where they're going to be. They wiped out, I think, virtually all the Hezbollah leadership in one meeting. They wiped out virtually all of the Iranian Air Force leadership in one meeting. I mean, how do they do all that?
And they did all that, I think, through a combination of, I'm no espionage scholar, but through a combination, based on what's been reported, through a combination of human intel and assumedly signals intel. So tech and human sources, probably being able to follow some folks around, being able to tap into the electronic systems. And again, these are the folks that are at the commanding heights of the Islamic Republic's political and military establishment. As we mentioned earlier, these are folks who are not necessarily promoted for their capability. They're promoted and rewarded for their loyalty. There's a couple exceptions here, two very lethal, very nasty individuals, but also very, very capable and competent. And I always do fear a very competent adversary. I think the commander of the Aerospace Force, Hajizadeh, and the Armed Forces General Staff, Chief Bagheri, these were people known to Iran watchers to be a little bit unlike their colleagues, who were actually technically and politically savvy, not that much evidence of financial or political corruption, but real true believers and a capable ideological but lethal adversary. Nonetheless, they still were obviously able to be surveilled, and the Israelis went after them to induce this surprise effect, to induce this shock that when you saw the reporting about all of these IRGC folks in one place, or all of these nuclear scientists too, which is a separate story, targeted in Tehran at the same time. I think it was 4:30 in the morning, if I'm not mistaken. It was very reminiscent of what we all watched on the news back in September 2024 with the pager gate and the beeper gate in Lebanon. And that just goes to show you how effective the intelligence arm of Israel is and how critical intelligence is to even a conventional war-fighting campaign.
So the Israelis hit them in a, I think, pretty powerful initial round. But the Iranians do fire back at the Israelis. I'm actually a little surprised because they've been firing at civilians when I would have thought they'd have been much better off to try to hit the airfields. I mean, if they could slow down the tempo of the Israeli Air Force, and the best way to do that is to kill the planes on the ground. But they're going for Tel Aviv, for Haifa. What do you think is their rationale for basically doing area bombardment that has almost no strategic effect, but just causes pain?
Well, I think that is the intention, to cause pain. But also on day one, I think on Friday, the regime's first ballistic missile wave that followed the first drone wave essentially did try to go after some air bases. But even in the Persian press, which hyperbolizes a lot of stuff, they ended up saying that the following waves were essentially all targeting population centers. And they mentioned Haifa, they mentioned Tel Aviv, and they mentioned a couple of other suburbs, particularly Ramat Gan, for example. But they mentioned that this was basically targeting cities. Occasionally, IRGC leadership and what is left of the military leadership, or who became the new military leadership, would say, oh, please leave these cities. But ultimately, the regime was trying to break the will of the Israelis to fight, and also break the will of the Israelis to actually stay in Israel. I mean, these are folks who don't believe in Zionism. They don't actually believe that Israelis are Israeli. They believe if you scratch them, they're probably European or South American or Arab or something else. So they're also trying to induce strategically in the long term the same kind of shock waves that they hoped that their proxy would have set off back on October 7th, which is to land a blow on Israeli society and foster reverse immigration away from Israel. I mean, that is a bit longer term, but they were trying to draw blood. And specializing in Iran's long-range strike capabilities, I got to tell you, the regime does believe, like you talked about mass, the regime does believe that quantity has a quality of its own, but these are qualitatively more impactful systems than we've seen in the past. Yes, less have made it through, but that is just because of how well layered Israel's air and missile defense is. But there are apartments, city blocks, tons of civilian centers. This is a massive counter-value campaign that the Islamic Republic of Iran has engaged in and really should be further exposed and shed light on one day. But the regime was trying to get even and draw blood, and also to try to erode the will of the Israelis to continue their military campaign, because the Israeli military campaign is focused on basically defanging Iran's long-range threat, going after the missiles, the drones, but also the launchers and the support infrastructure.
When you look at all this, the Israelis are gaining, but they have not delivered a knockout punch. The Iranians are less and less capable, but they're still hanging in. How vital do you think it is for the U.S. to use its very, very large bombs against the Fordo nuclear site facility? Or do you think it's possible that by just continuing to erode the regime, at some point the Israelis could force the Iranians to actually dismantle it themselves?
I don't think alone the Israelis will force them to dismantle it themselves, but I do think alone the Israelis will be dismantling large chunks of it themselves. It depends on what the priorities are for the Israelis in their targeting campaign, to keep going after bases, to go after future supply lines, to go after the existing arsenal, to go after elements of the shorter range arsenal. There's a whole host of military variables for the Israelis. And just because the Israelis don't have the B-2 bomber or the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster bombs doesn't, in my view, mean that they can't do other damage. Perhaps they could bring in special forces, some kind of above ground, below ground team, or they could train to hit the same spot, given that they've taken out the air defenses and they have more freedom of maneuver and operation. In Iran, they could train to drop their own more limited bunker busters, like the 2,000-pound bombs, in the same spot and try to have them burrow deeper and deeper. You can also disable some of these facilities by going after their support infrastructure, airways, shafts, vents, and even electricity. You can cripple it that way as well. But there's no doubt if you're talking about a knockout punch, that is much more likely going to have to come, in my view, from Uncle Sam, if you're going to quite literally try to collapse the architecture of this Fordo facility, which is about 300 feet underground.
A couple of years ago, there was an amazing Israeli Special Forces raid in Syria, where they took out an Iranian nuclear facility that they were building in Syria. I mean, they went in very precisely, did the job, and got back out with no casualties. Do you think that Fordo is too far inside Iran and just physically too big to have that kind of a commando approach?
With the surprises the Israelis have had up their sleeves over the past few years, you can really never say never. But if the Israelis have this aerial overmatch or superiority, we should say, against the Iranians, and they can translate that into a few more pockets in the land, there's a heck of a lot more they can do that could allow them to basically bring in through an uncontested air corridor across the Middle East special forces to do this. Oh, and by the way, a dividend of this is if the Israelis are trying to much more narrowly tailor their campaign, there would be no civilian casualties in this sort of scenario. It would be more of a one and done situation. So if you create the military space, this could become a political option. Conversely, you mentioned how else America might get involved. I still do think there's a chance that America might try to leverage Israel's increasing military successes into trying to get Khamenei to accept this dismantle or die paradigm. And the reason I'm mentioning that while you're asking me about Fordo is because right now we don't know what's going on at Fordo. I mean, I've been in a lot of war games. They've usually had me role play the Iranian side. Whenever my side is hit, I try to squirrel away as much uranium as possible. So we don't know enough about diversion, God forbid, potentially happening there. And we don't know if the machines that were already spinning and thus far are still stable and assumed to be spinning in Fordo, which has been hit by the Israelis but not penetrated. We don't know if the machines that used to be producing 60%, which is a hop, skip, and a jump to weapons grade, just made that final hop, skip, and a jump and went to 90%. And that's a huge intelligence question. And no matter the military successes the Israelis have against the rest of Iran's missile and military infrastructure, if they get the counter-proliferation element of this larger campaign wrong, there will be more issues, shall we say politely, to have to deal with.
Do you have any sense of whether the regular military has been particularly degraded? And what I'm thinking of is, if you have absolute air superiority, you can bring in, with C-130s, a pretty large number of troops who could, in fact, occupy and take over Fordo and methodically destroy it. And the question will be how rapidly and how coherently the Iranian military would be capable of responding, even in their own country, given the fact that they're now operating under complete Israeli air superiority.
Well, given that we'd be talking about the conventional military, which is larger than the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but really underserviced and underfunded, there's certainly the chance that they would have to engage them because they would probably have to try to defend either the airfield or the base or whatever facility the Israelis would try to come at or drive at or fly at or land at. So there probably would, in my view, be a firefight. How significant it would be is really more of a crystal ball question at this point in time. But I think if the military successes the Israelis have elsewhere are high and the messaging is good, this could be really more of a lay down your arms. We have no qualms with the people who are trying to protect their country. But if you fight, you're not trying to protect your country. You're trying to protect the Ayatollah's nuclear enterprise. And there is public diplomacy, public messaging space, both for Israel and America to exploit there. Because one way we can prevent this from being a civil war is if you do get some of the security services to flip.
Right. I mean, you could end up in a Syrian civil war kind of problem where you have 2 or 3 or more factions fighting for control. Let me ask one last thing about all this. Are we at a point where we really have an opportunity to profoundly reshape the region by eliminating the primary sponsor of terrorism? Or is that an overreach with where we are?
I think we're getting closer towards the first opportunity to get rid of that state sponsor of terrorism. But that requires, again, so many politicians to have the courage of their convictions. There's so many easy punts, unfortunately, I see across the Atlantic in the West trying to say, no, regime change is only local. We can't have anything foreign imposed. No one is asking for anything foreign imposed. And I'm not here to beg for charity or whatever. I'm an American citizen first and foremost, and only, by the way. But foreign policy is not missionary work. That's a Henry Kissinger quote that I really love, by the way. But if you have the opportunity to deal your adversary a blow and then also do good by your own ideology, and then to bring into power someone who also shares your ideology, and then you have the luxury of living up to your style of government, which is all about representative government, and you realize there's a people over there who for 100 years have been trying to have representative government, this isn't foreign imposed. This is foreign supported. And that is why Iran is not Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. That's my view of it. But I understand absolutely there's a million and one things that can go wrong. There's a million and one issues opposition-wise. There's a million and one issues in terms of resource scarcity and political capital and attention. I understand all of those things. But I also understand that we do have to finally find a way to flip the script on the Ayatollahs, because it would be, in my view, strategic, political, and moral malpractice to decapitate the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and leave an 86, 88 million person nation smoldering as a failed state. And that would risk losing one of the things that Iran is that really nowhere else in the region is, which is both pro-American and pro-Israeli. And that's an asset that the U.S. and particularly Israel cannot afford to lose.
My guess is if we had a stable government willing to work with the rest of the world, that the number, for example, of stunningly successful Iranian Americans who would have an interest in helping rebuild the country they came from would represent a source of both entrepreneurial knowledge and sheer capital that would be breathtaking, because the diaspora is pretty big and pretty prosperous. And if they had a place where they were safe and they were welcomed, we could have a pretty prosperous Iran within 10 years.
Amen.
Listen, Behnam, I want to thank you for joining me. We are going through wild times. We may have to call on you again in the not-too-distant future just because of all the changes. Our listeners can learn more about your work at Foundation for Defense of Democracies by visiting your website at fdd.org. And I really want to thank you for taking the time in the middle of all of these activities.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Thank you to my guest, Behnam Ben Taleblu. You can learn more about the Foundation for Defense of Democracies on our show page at newsworld.com. Newsworld is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newsworld, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newsworld can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newsworld.